willkommen zu dieser 224. Ausgabe von Europe Calling in Zusammenarbeit dieses Mal zum
Welcome
zweiten
to
Mal
the
mit Niki Georgiou und
2024th
Annette Schlicht
edition of the
über
Europe
Fastmonth,
Calling in
die es zusammen
cooperation with the
mit uns
Friedrich
heute
Ebert
Abend eingestellt
Foundation,
haben. Schön, dass ihr
with
mit dabei
Annette
seid und ganz
Schlicht
besonders
and
begrüßen
Hubert
die heutigen
Kaufmann.
Gäste, die ihr
We're
schon
very
viele
happy to
kennengelernt
welcome
habt.
you here,
Mein
and you will also
Name ist
be
Maximilian Fries, ich bin
familiarized with our
Geschäftsführer von
guest
Europe Calling und
speakers.
leite
My
gemeinsam
name
mit
is
Niki.
Maximilian
Wir
Fries. I'm
sprechen
the
heute mit
managing
extra
director of
Flämisch,
Europe
Deutsch und Englisch.
Calling, and I'll be
Für alle,
moderating
die alle
this
drei
meeting.
sprechen können,
We'll be
über
speaking a mix
Zoom
of
sind
languages, English,
Dolmetschen für
German, and
zukünftige
Greek. For
Kollegen und
those who do
Supporterinnen
not speak
danke
all the
jetzt
three
schon an
languages, you will
und
find interpretation channels
in
under the
English.
globe in
Welcome
the
to this, our
control panel.
224th Europe Calling webinar. Today we will speak mostly English, German, and a bit of Greek. If you don't speak all of them, please check out the globe in the control panel and choose the language you want to have interpreted for yourself. So, wieder zurück auf Deutsch und bevor wir starten, ein paar ganz kurze
Before
Hausmitteilungen.
we actually
Wie immer bei
start,
Europe Calling
I
dürft
have
ihr eure
some
Fragen stellen und die
housekeeping
Fragen gerne auch
news for you.
bewerten.
You can,
Heute nutzen wir dafür
as
zwei
always with
Links. Den
Europe
Link dazu
Calling,
findet ihr im Chat
ask your
und solltet ihr
questions
eine
and
Frage
rate the
dazu
questions of others.
platzieren.
We will use
Über Fragen
Slido
freue
for this.
Anmeldung und
You will see the
ansonsten
link
könnt ihr
in the
natürlich
chat
Fragen
and
stellen.
feel free to ask
Heute
your
ist, wie gesagt,
questions.
der Link in den
1,200
Show Notes.
registrations
Und ganz wichtig,
um,
schreibt eure Namen dazu. Es wird
are
einfach schöner, wenn ihr
registered
vorne stehen
today.
und nicht hinter
And
anderen.
of
Könnt
course,
in jeder
we
Frage, in
would
jeder Sprache stellen,
encourage you
die
to
Frage stellen, die ihr gerne
put
möchtet.
your name
Heute
along with
dürft ihr
your
auch in
question.
Griechisch
You could use
sprechen.
all the languages
Wie
available
immer wird Europe Calling
in
aufgezeichnet und wir werden das
interpretation
Ganze
to
als
raise
Podcast
your
online
questions,
gestellt.
and then afterwards, the
Das war es auch schon mit diesen
recording
kurzen
of this webinar
Hausmitteilungen.
will be
Nicht viel
available on
zu tun und
YouTube
ich
and
übergebe
as a
jetzt
podcast.
dann auch gleich
We
an
have a
Annette Schlicht aus
lot
dem
of
Referat Globale und Europäische Politik
work
für
to
das
do here
Thema
tonight, and I would like to hand
Europawahlt
over to
2024
Annette
für das
Schlicht
Thema
from the
Parlament
Global
Pandemie und
Politics and
Entwicklung.
Development
Viel
Department of
Bildungsarbeit
the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. Today
Translation
she
und
was
Rezeption
in Nepal and
gemacht und
Benin
hat, wie
before
schon
that
gesagt,
and
kommt
has
dieses Webinar
worked
wieder.
on
Wird
migration and
aus dem
participation in the
Wageningen
political
initiiert,
education
gemeinsam mit Hubert
department,
Faustmann, Leiter der
together with
Bundesrepublik Zypern
Hubert
und übergebe
Faustmann,
sie einfach
who's
an
based
Annette,
in
die
Cyprus.
alles weitere
She
sagt.
will
Liebe Annette,
be
du hast das Wort.
giving her input. You have the floor,
Ja, vielen
Annette.
Dank, lieber Max. Alles
Yeah,
Weitere,
thank you very much,
da freue ich mich
Max.
natürlich auf
And
unsere tollen
indeed, I
Gäste. Aber
look
ich will eine
forward
ganz kleine
to our guest
Einführung
speakers.
machen.
But
Worum soll es heute gehen?
let
Wir
me
wollen den Blick
introduce you to the
auf einen
subject.
Hotspot
What are we going to talk
der
about? We would like to talk about a
EU-Migrationspolitik legen, und zwar
hotspot
auf
of
das
the EU
östliche
migration
Mittelmeer.
policy, and that's the
Denn entgegen dem
Eastern
allgemeinen
Mediterranean.
Trend, wonach die
Because
Anzahl
against
der
the
irregulären
general
Einreisenden in die
trend,
EU in 2024
whereby
um 50
the irregular
gefallen ist,
migration into the
beziehen sich
EU
da die
has
Zahlen von
fallen
Frontex vom
by
Januar diesen Jahres,
40%, and I'm
sind
reporting
auf
on
der östlichen
numbers
Mittelmeerroute mehr
registered by
Schutzsuchende
Frontex.
unterwegs.
We have
Nach
more
der
people
EU-Türkei-Erklärung von
migrating
2016
via the
sind die
Eastern
Zahlen noch fallen
Mediterranean
lassen, gab es
route.
insbesondere in den
And
letzten drei
the
Jahren einen
declaration of the EU
signifikanten
policy
Anstieg von Menschen,
of
die sich auf tiefer Route auf den
2016
Weg nach
helped
Europa
to
machen.
decrease the
Sie
number of
kommen nach wie vor
migrants,
aus
but now
Syrien, sie kommen aus
it is growing
Afghanistan,
again,
zunehmend aber
and
auch
very
aus
much
dem
so. They
Sudan
come from
und aus
Syria,
Ägypten.
Afghanistan, from
Wir wollen uns
Sudan,
deshalb
and
heute Abend
also
fragen, warum
much
das
more
so
now
ist
from
und welche
Egypt. And
Faktoren
we would like
dazu
to
führen.
consider the reasons
Nur um das mal anzusprechen,
why
natürlich
and
wird es
what the
auch um die Frage
factors
des
are that
Bürgerkriegs im
push
Sudan
people to
gehen, die
migrate.
Situation in
Of
Gaza und
course,
die
we'll be talking
wirtschaftliche
about
Situation
the
in
civil
Ägypten.
war in Sudan, the
Gleichzeitig
economic
wollen wir natürlich
situation in
aber auch
Egypt, and
diskutieren,
this
welche
the
Wirkung
civil
die im
war
letzten von
in
der EU beschlossenen
Gaza. And
Migrationsabkommen mit
we
Ägypten
would
und dem
like to talk
Libanon
about
haben.
the migration agreements
Welche
with
Rolle spielen
Lebanon
sie
and
eigentlich in dieser in vielerlei
Egypt,
Hinsicht ja explosiven
signed by the
Situation?
European Union.
Zeitigt der
What
nach
is their role in
2015
this
von der EU
explosive
ausgerufene
situation? In
Paradigmenwechsel in
2015,
der
the European
Migrationspolitik
Union called
wirken?
for a paradigm change
Sind die
in the
umfassenden
migration policy.
Migrationsabkommen, die sie
And
ja
we have
sowohl in der neuen
very
gemeinsamen Asylpolitik
comprehensive
als auch
migration
der EU
agreements
als auch im
under the
Koalitionsvertrag ihren Ausdruck finden,
common
tatsächlich wirksam
European asylum system.
im Sinne
Do
ihrer
they really
Zielsetzung,
work?
aber auch
Do they
welche
really
Auswirkungen
achieve
haben
their
sie auf den
objectives?
Menschenrechtsschutz?
What are
Und last
their
not least ist
implications
natürlich die
for
Frage,
people who
welche
look
Entwicklungen
for
in der
protection
Region
and for
in
shelter?
der Zukunft zu
Which movements do we have to expect? What are the reactions to be expected, and how can we prepare for that? My colleague Hubert Vossmann has already been mentioned. He's the director of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Cyprus. He has worked together with ELIAMEP and the Institute for Public Policy of International Affairs of the American Policy Institute in Beirut, and they have carried out a wide-ranging study in the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, Lebanon, Egypt, and Cyprus. Two experts will be speaking to us. They will be presenting the results. And I really look forward to that. Angeliki Dimitriadi, who's an independent expert and a political scientist, will be reporting. She'll be reporting on irregular migration and asylum, and she will be reporting on the results of the study, certainly also on comparing.
The floor is yours.
Angeliki, you have the.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation today to this webinar. As you've said, I'm going to try to present a little bit some of the basic findings of the synthesis report with an emphasis on Greece. But before I attempt to share my screen with a PowerPoint, let me give you a little bit of a background onto why this research took place. We started the different institutes from Greece, Cyprus, and Lebanon. We started speaking and exchanging around irregular migration in the Eastern Mediterranean as early as really the beginning of 2024. It had become clear that though certain things were very much the same, we were also seeing certain shifts in the region in terms of departure points, certain nationalities, the makeup of people that were on the move, and also the relationship that was unfolding in the broader region between these countries, including Egypt. So we decided that we wanted to proceed with the research looking at the last 5 years in terms of what had changed and what had stayed the same. But more importantly, and I think this is where the research is of particular added value at this specific time, to understand what the commonalities across these countries are in the region. And I stress the word commonality because we tend to think of EU member states and non-EU member states as regards migration, and especially as regards migration policy. And yet what this research finds, and what I would like to highlight today, and what I'm going to be emphasizing, is that in this shared Mediterranean space, because it is a shared Mediterranean space, we actually do have a lot of commonalities in terms of how the different countries are approaching the issue of irregular migration and asylum, despite the fact that they have very different geographies, very different histories, and 2 countries are EU member states, with the other 2, of course, being the recipient of predominantly EU policies. So having said that, I would like to share with you some of the findings that we have from this research. I'm not sure if you can see the screen here. Okay. So as I said, this is a research that took place in 2024. It concluded in the summer of 2024, and the reports were written and produced basically by December of 2024. I stress this because obviously now we are 4 months into 2025, and some things have changed, although specifically as regards Greece, I would say not that much. The first thing, and this is what I started with, is the importance of the region. This is a region that has traditionally been, and by traditionally really the last decade, on the receiving end of EU migration policy, a focus of certain EU member states with an emphasis on preventing, reducing, deterring irregular migration. And I'm specifically speaking here about mixed migratory flows. That means people that are on the move and are very well economic migrants, but also asylum seekers or even prima facie refugees. And that's important to keep in mind. We're talking about mixed migratory movement, which means they have different needs, and we do not know these needs until they reach the territory. Now, one of the things that had become quite clear already before we began the research was that the countries had a different role in the migratory journey, so to speak. What used to be sites of transit had potentially also evolved into destination countries for certain nationalities, both for migrants and asylum seekers. What were destination countries had transformed into transit countries. And this was very much the case for both Lebanon and Egypt, but also Greece and Cyprus. Cyprus less as a transit site by virtue of its geography. It prevents transitory movement to a large extent, but it is a recent addition, if you'd like, in the migratory journey as a destination country. We also had began noticing that there was movement to and from Lebanon, I'm referring here to the Egyptians, to the Syrians predominantly, to and from Egypt, to and from Greece, as well as to Cyprus. So when we started the mapping of the research, we tried to understand what were the commonalities and what were the differences. And one of the things that we identified quite early on was that all of the 4 countries had a mutual interest in reducing irregular migration. And I mean, they had a mutual national interest, irrespective of the EU, which is a key player in the region. Each of these countries had prioritized the reduction of irregular migration on its own because they perceived irregular migration, and they still do to a large extent, as a problem domestically. And in some countries more linked with socio-political cohesion, with others also with economic ability to absorb irregular migration. The other commonality is that they have all incorporated migration in their foreign policy. So they have developed migration diplomacy. For some countries in the region, this is not new. Egypt, for example, has for quite some time developed an extensive migration diplomacy, and my colleague Amina will be talking about this later on. But for others, and especially Greece and Cyprus from the EU side, this is fairly recent. It's a fairly new development of the last 5 years. For Cyprus, it is a result of the fact that it started receiving irregular migration, which it hadn't before, at least not in significant numbers. For Greece, the turning point, if you'd like, is really the events, the border crisis in Evros in 2020, just before the lockdown of the pandemic. The other common element, which sort of shapes the broader frame of our research, is the role of the EU. And this is where it becomes particularly interesting. You have 2 EU member states and 2 non-EU member states, and yet in all 4 of the countries, the EU is an external player. It constructs through its policies an unequal burden-sharing arrangement and transforms all of these 4 countries into gatekeepers. So that means that both Greece and Cyprus, despite being EU member states, are treated first and foremost as shields of Europe, shields of the external borders, as gatekeepers for irregular migration, including, of course, asylum seekers, which impacts very much how the countries themselves see, understand, and respond to migration. And that's important to keep in mind because it is EU migration policy, and especially now with the PAC, the new legislative package that was passed in the European Parliament prior to the last European Parliament elections, which very much emphasizes the importance of the foreign policy dimension of migration. We have seen for quite some time this attempt to outsource, but we would posit that this outsourcing also takes place at the external borders of the EU to EU frontline countries like Greece and Cyprus. So this is the broader context, if you'd like, the general frame through which the commonalities in the region and the different countries have been looked at and approached. So what are the more specific elements? First, as regards irregular mobility, this is a common theme really throughout, which very much has to do with the fact that in all of these countries, legal migration, especially for asylum seekers, is extremely problematic. But we're also seeing differences. Of course, we have different numbers and different nationalities that are arriving across the region. Mobility, however, remains a defining feature. What's important to note is that we have variations in terms of the nationalities that arrive in the frontline countries of the EU. So, for example, Greece is a country that in 2024 recorded an increase in comparison to other frontline states of the EU. And it noted that its main nationalities were, of course, the Syrians and the Afghans, which are two traditional nationalities in terms of arrivals here in Greece, but also Palestinians, Lebanese, Sudanese, and Egyptians. The Lebanese and the Egyptians, as well as the Sudanese, but especially the Lebanese and the Egyptians, are a fairly new addition. They appear in the data really in the last 3 years, and they very much reflect the changing landscape domestically in Lebanon and, of course, in Egypt as a result of the socioeconomic crisis that these countries went through. For the Syrians, for the Afghans, for the Palestinians, and for the Sudanese, of course, the main reasons for displacement are quite well known. We're talking about conflict, but we're also seeing secondary displacement. We're seeing displacement as a result of economic hardships in the countries of transit from which they originated. We're seeing socioeconomic and political instability that is also triggering their movement. And of course, the broader deteriorating conditions specifically for the Syrians in the region that lead to further displacement. As I'm sure you're all aware, has increasingly become very difficult for Syrians to remain in a lot of the countries in the region, and especially close to Syria. The fact that we have these factors of movement is not new, but what it is relatively new is that we're seeing mobility from countries of transit and from previous destinations. So we're seeing, or at least we saw at the time, departure of Syrians from Lebanon to Libya, and from Libya to Greece. We saw departures of Egyptians through the Libyan border, again to Greece, which is a relatively new route that opened in late 2021 and remains a prominent one to this day. So irregular movement, irregular mobility is something that we're seeing across the region and remains a key dominant characteristic. The second commonality is deterrence policies. I said to you from the beginning that what the countries share is a prioritization in the deterrence of irregular migration. This is something that they seek domestically, outside of EU migration policy. We have seen this played out in very different way across the different countries, but we're also seeing certain similarities. And this is where migration diplomacy kicks in and the role of foreign policy. Greece is a country that has traditionally utilized detention and bureaucratic obstacles in order to undertake deterrence policies. By bureaucratic obstacles, I'm referring to limiting access to documents, making it very difficult for people to remain even if they have acquired refugee status, utilizing basically as much as possible bureaucratic procedures to render the country an inhospitable destination, both for arrival but also for settlement. To this, we have a series of allegations around pushbacks at the maritime and especially the land border of Evros, inhumane conditions in the hotspots, with NGOs repeatedly calling for the need to increase assistance, and especially as regards healthcare, but also provision of food. There was a recent report about malnutrition in some of the hotspots. And there has also been an emphasis on deportation. On top of this, Greece increased, if one could say increase, the facilitation, so to speak, of onward movement. And this is where the bureaucratic obstacles come in handy. Even for those who do receive the refugee status, and until 2024, there was a significant percentage of positive recognitions in Greece. Even for those that receive protection, the absence of sufficient assistance in order to settle into the country and remain has pushed them to undertake secondary movement to countries like Germany. And this has been one of the points of conflict, so to speak, between Greece and Germany as regards migration. On top of this, Greece has developed recently a migration diplomacy that tries to balance out deterrence by including legal migration. And again, this is where the linkages in the countries come in. It has prioritized and heavily supported migration deals with Lebanon and with Egypt. There is a reason for this. Egypt is one of the main countries from which irregular arrivals are coming to the island of Rhabdos off the coast of Crete. Egyptians are now third in the nationalities, or if I'm not mistaken, second in 2025 in the data. So migration diplomacy with Egypt seeks to balance deterrence, whereby Egypt increases its border controls in exchange for legal migration deals for migrant laborers to come in for a very short amount of time to work mainly in the agricultural fields of Greece. This is something that has not been fully implemented yet, but it gives you an indication of how Greece is trying to shape its foreign policy on migration in order to still prioritize deterrence by offering a small carrot, which is legal migration pathways for migrant laborers. Cyprus is another country that has prioritized deterrence. It is implementing accelerated procedures for asylum applications. It has utilized extensively a list of safe third countries. Application for Syrians have been suspended since April 2024, and it has pushed for a return program to Syria. It has also been heavily criticized for detention conditions, and the report in Cyprus details the information on this. Lebanon is a country that sits outside the EU, but nonetheless prioritizes deterrence, as I said, as a result of its domestic priorities. There has been, and at the time when we were researching and writing the reports, this was already in play, stricter regulations for the stay of the Syrians, a reintroduction of the voluntary return plan for Syrian refugees. And we all know that Lebanon has a deal with the EU that pretty much offers financial support for Lebanon's crumbling economy, with the aim also of ensuring that Lebanon keeps the Syrians in its territory or facilitates their return to Syria, should that be feasible. And finally, you have Egypt. Egypt is a country that already hosts a significant number of refugees and asylum seekers. Again, my colleague will be speaking in more detail about this. But what we do know is that it has been criticized for deportation of Sudanese refugees already since 2023. And is imposing strict limitations on Syrians that are trying to arrive in Egypt. It is a country also that is increasingly willing to partner with the EU to reduce as much as possible departures from its territory. It is fairly successful in that, I should say. We don't have a lot of boat departures from Egypt directly. What we do have is Egyptians leaving from Egypt but crossing through Libya. Which is the most common pathway. So deterrence is something that they all share also across the region. The final point that I wanna make is that because they prioritize deterrence and because they tend to respond towards irregular migration with policies that seek to prevent or facilitate transit or return, there is immigration without integration. And I think that's important to stress. And I think that's important to stress on two levels. First, as regards EU member states like Greece and Cyprus, it's worth remembering that integration is not only inscribed essentially in the EU framework, but it's something that is essential in both preventing secondary movement, especially from frontline states to Northern Europe, but is also an important component of a successful migration policy. What we're seeing is that both in Greece and in Cyprus, integration exists on paper, but not in practice. In practice, in both countries, in different ways, there is significant exclusion and difficulties in integrating. Both deploy bureaucratic mechanisms to achieve that. For Greece, I would add the caveat that it was a country that underwent for a decade a financial crisis. So it's important to note that a lot of the things that are required for integration were not only absent for migrants and refugees, they were also absent for the Greek population. Nonetheless, especially as regards access to language, skill development, employability, and housing, these are issues that continue to plague the asylum seekers and especially the refugees in the country. Cyprus is fairly new to this, again, because it is fairly new as a destination country in the migratory journey. It has an action plan that it was designed and presented in late 2024, but so far we can safely speak about immigration without integration. It has remained on paper. Egypt and Lebanon are slightly different. They're not restricted by EU requirements, but at the same time, what we've seen across both of these countries is a differentiation in terms of how integration unfolds. In Egypt, it depends very much on the legal status. If one is an undocumented migrant, if one is a refugee, nationality can also be a factor. For Lebanon, we know that there are significant restrictions in access to services. There are legal barriers, and there are also significant financial costs attached to accessing these services and accessing the integration process as a result, which means automatically a significant portion of the population is excluded. The interesting part is that despite their vast differences, again, as I've said, as regards politics, history, geography, all of these countries share certain commonalities. Integration is not a priority for any of these countries. Deterrence remains a key priority. And increasingly, they are adopting policies that will render them less hospitable, and as this is especially the case for Egypt and Lebanon, to refugees in the region, because these are two countries that have traditionally hosted a significant number of refugees until now, whether it is the Syrians, the Sudanese, or other nationalities. And this is, and I will conclude with this, this is, I think, where we're also seeing the influence of the EU as an actor. The foreign policy of migration of the EU has sought for a very long time to export the EU model of, on the one hand, respecting human rights, giving access to asylum, boosting national asylum systems, creating asylum systems where they may not exist. Again, Egypt is a good example of this with its new law. And at the same time, asking these countries to function as a gatekeeper. And I think what we're seeing and what is evident in the report, but also in what has been taking place in the last couple of years, is that the lesson that they're learning, which is a lesson that also frontline states of the EU have learned, is that it's in the attempt to balance these two is not always successful. So they will always lean more towards deterrence in an effort to both stay on the EU's good side, so to speak, continue to receive the financial assistance and arrangement, because all of these four countries are receiving significant financial assistance from the EU for the management of migration, instead of prioritizing protection of refugees and people on the move. Thank you.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, Angeliki, für die Ausführungen und für die super spannenden Ergebnisse eurer Studien und natürlich auch des Vergleichs. Ich habe eine kurze Rückfrage, bevor wir etwas tiefer in ein Land nochmal schauen. Und zwar, du bist ja wirklich schon sehr lange in diesem Bereich unterwegs, bist ja ausgewiesene Expertin für Migrationspolitik. Was hat dich denn am meisten überrascht an diesen Studien, an den Ergebnissen auch, die dabei rausgekommen sind?
I think I would say there were two findings that were surprising to me. One is, to be honest, I didn't expect to find that many similarities, precisely because I was under the clearly mistaken assumption that you have two sides of the Mediterranean, but because they have these significant differences between them, right? And because they have very different political systems and very different also legal systems as regards protection and refugee law, and some are signatories to the 1951 Convention, some are not, that we would find bigger differences rather than commonality. So that was the one thing that surprised me. The second thing that surprised me is that I think they're learning from each other. They're learning from each other more than we assume. So Egypt, and they're learning also from what takes place in the region. So Egypt and Lebanon very clearly learned from the EU-Turkey statement. They very clearly learned what it meant to have a deal of this kind with a financial arrangement in place, but all the burdens, so to speak, shifting towards Turkey's side, how this didn't work out, what it also meant potentially for Turkey and its relationship with the EU. And they went for very different types of deals. They have also learned from, I think, from each other. They have learned also from seeing what has played out in Greece with the hotspots, which is a very good example, and what to avoid. So if you remember, one of the first things that Egypt was very clear about was that it would not host external processing centers for the EU. This was never for them on the table. They are learning from the things that are happening in the region. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Ja, ganz vielen Dank. Da werden wir sicherlich noch drauf zurückkommen.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we'll be coming back to that. We have certainly already heard about the agreements, the agreement between Egypt and the EU and Lebanon, of course. But I'm very happy to now welcome Amina Fahmy. She's also an independent migration expert. And I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think you are connecting from Cairo, if I'm not mistaken, and she's active in the area of migration policy and international aid, international relations. And we're very happy to welcome you. And we look forward to a spotlight on the situation in Egypt, where you will be reporting on the study, and we look forward to your results. You have the floor.
Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I'm really glad that Angeliki already set the floor for me, and now I can talk more about the case of Egypt. A lot of the things that I will be talking about will highlight the things that Angeliki has discussed, so whether it's the similarities or differences between different countries. Give me a second to share my presentation. 1 second. I believe. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So as Angeliki was talking, there has been obviously a shift in migration movements, especially the ones shaping the Mediterranean realm. And I will be discussing mainly the case of Egypt. So the migration flows from the Middle East and North Africa, especially in the recent years, have seen a great surge. This has mainly been fueled by economic difficulties in the region, as well as increasing instability, whether it's political and economic instability. So Egypt's role mainly in this aspect, as Angeliki mentioned, has been kind of shifting. So between becoming a transit destination and between being a destination country and a transit country. So historically speaking, Egypt has both been a destination and also a transit country, but specifically in recent years, with the increase of instability in the region, we are seeing an increase in Egypt's role as a destination country. So, for example, with the case of Sudan, we have the war in Sudan that has been occurring. Since 2023, Egypt received a huge wave of Sudanese refugees, which is now the hugest registered refugees in Egypt, accounting for more than 500,000 refugees. And this is a huge shift. And most of these refugees are seeking Egypt as a destination country, okay? And then secondly, we have the Syrian refugees, which is the second largest refugee population in Egypt, accounting for almost 160,000 refugees. And then we also have other refugees, like refugees from South Sudan, as well as Eritrea and other countries in Africa. So the major shift that's happening is that recently, with the increasing instability, As a destination country, Egypt has been receiving more and more refugees and asylum seekers, and this has definitely changed a lot of the dynamics, whether in the foreign policy or in its domestic policies. So yeah, Egypt's political and economic situation right now is characterized by also a lot of, I would say, instability. So we are facing a lot of economical challenges. Since 2016, we've had a lot of, we have received an IMF loan, which has resulted in the application of structural adjustments that have affected so many things in Egyptian standards of life, including subsidy cuts, for example, for bread, which has increased the price by almost 300%. We have also dealt with 5 devaluations since after 2011, which has also, the first devaluation has cut the value of Egyptian pound by 50%. We also have increasing in inflation. And all this has also led to also an economic and political backdrop that is also unstable. So basically, when it comes to European migration from Egypt, we have a lot of a change that has been recorded recently is more of the increase of labor migration to Europe, which has been increasing with time. So Egypt, after 2011 and the Arab uprisings, had an estimated of almost 6.5 million migrants living abroad. And traditionally, these have favored Gulf countries. And the migrants in Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE have accounted for a third of the migrant population. But actually, what has been changing is the reassessment of the destination countries for Egyptians seeking to escape or get out of this economical situation in Egypt. So both Egyptians are now exploring more increasingly regular and irregular pathways, and specifically in Europe. So when it comes to regular pathways, we have an increasing trend with an interest in skilled labor moving to countries, for example, like Europe, like Germany, where there are certain labor shortages in certain fields, like, for example, the medical field, for example, technical fields. And actually these structured pathways, these labor pathways, offer Egyptians great opportunities, but they also deal with, for example, labor shortages in certain countries, for example, whether it is in agriculture, tourism, construction, or healthcare. So there are several bilateral agreements that have been taking place for labor agreements between Egypt and European countries. Most commonly and most popular one of them is the one with Italy. And then, as Angeliki mentioned, there was also a memorandum of understanding that was signed in 2022 with Greece, with the aim of sending Egyptian seasonal workers for agriculture, but this is still pending. And recently, actually quite recently, maybe a month ago or maybe less, there's also been talks by Bulgaria, which to increase the cooperation between Egypt in the field of labor migration. So and another thing that's worth mentioning when we're talking about irregular migration to the European Union is something that Angeliki touched on at the beginning, is that there have been almost no coastal departures from Egypt itself, but most of what's happening is that they are departing through Libya. Historically speaking, Egypt and Libya have very strong historical ties, and Egyptians post and before 2011 and the Arab uprisings have been very strong fabric in the Libyan labor market. And for example, before 2011, there was a total of 144,000 of Egyptians in Libya. Okay, so this is just to give you kind of an idea of how much Egyptians were in Libya. Okay, after the instability in Libya, a lot of Egyptians returned back. A lot of Egyptians turned back from Libya. And now actually there is an increasing encouragement even by the government for Egyptians to seek employment opportunities in Libya. So this is also have been considered maybe a way for as how this is considered kind of the pathways to which how Egyptians, a lot of Egyptians have actually used Libya in order to get to Europe. So actually there has been deportations of Egyptians that have been Libya last year. Actually in 2023, there have been thousands of Egyptians that were deported from Libya and on foot. And this, I think, is mainly a consideration because of the increasing arrivals of Egyptians to Europe through Libya. Another thing that I would like to mention is that Egypt, the main trend that Angeliki also touched on, is that this trend of irregular migration of Egyptians to Europe has been mainly occurring from young men from rural areas, okay? And by mid-2024, actually, Egyptians were among the most represented nationalities in Greece and Italy. They were accounting for 12% of arrivals in Greece and 6% in Italy. So this is all kind of, as Angeliki mentioned, a bit new to see, relatively new to see Egyptians, the increase of Egyptian arrivals to Greece specifically. And another thing that I really want to touch on is that I already mentioned at the beginning the refugee and asylum seeking population in Egypt, whether it is the Sudanese and Syrian refugees, and as well as South Sudanese. Another thing that also has a strong effect right now on the situation in Egypt is the war in Gaza. So actually, last year, it's estimated that Egypt received around 100,000 Palestinians. And this has also had a major effect on the not only the economic stability of Egypt, as it's already deteriorated, the economic situation is already deteriorating, but also another thing, the war in Gaza has also affected the revenue of the Suez Canal, which is one of Egypt's major revenues for foreign reserve of a foreign currency.
Mm-hmm.
So this is also a really adding factor to the economical hardship that Egypt is currently undergoing.
Amina, sorry, just one question. There's still the first slide that we see.
Oh,
maybe.
I
didn't. No problem.
I didn't change the
No problem. So now we are all on the right page here.
Okay, great.
Yeah, good.
So maybe I'll get back to this slide after I'm done with this point. So basically, as I was mentioning earlier, let me see here. Okay, maybe I'll get to this slide better. So as I was mentioning, with this mainly the issue occurring from the slash in Suez Canal revenues has also had a great effect on Egyptian economic situation, and is considered a push factor for migration of Egyptians, and not only Egyptians, but in general, this has led to the reduction of level of attractiveness of Egypt as a destination country. So as
Amina, may I just quickly interrupt you? So I think you're touching your microphone somehow, and this is for the interpreters. This is very loud sometimes. Okay. So maybe you could try to avoid this, but otherwise we're losing.
I have the presentations printed, so I have them on the computer.
So maybe separate the microphone.
Yeah. Okay.
Somehow. Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so when we talk about the push factors or the key factors for movements for Egyptians, we consider the macroeconomic level, as I was mentioning, the cut in Suez Canal revenues, the foreign currency devaluation, as shown on the slide, 40%, the removal of energy subsidies and higher taxes. So all this is considered a great part of the push factors for Egyptian migration to Europe. As well as another thing that I would like to touch on is climate change. So climate change has an increasing effect on Egyptian livelihoods, especially farmers. Farmers actually, and the agricultural sector in Egypt supports 55% of the population and employs over 30% of the population. However, climate change is posing increasingly a threat to food security in Egypt, and particularly in vulnerable rural and coastal regions. And this is particularly why a lot of the irregular migration campaigns aimed at raising awareness of irregular migration is targeted in these areas. Apart from food security, climate change is also affecting Egypt's water security, which is also increasingly threatened by the construction of the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam. So experts warn that actually a 2% reduction in the Nile water flow could lead to a loss of more than 200,000 acres of irrigated land. So Egypt is increasingly dealing with pressure and stresses on its natural resources. And this is, as I mentioned, affecting the livelihoods of many, many Egyptians. As I mentioned, 30% of the labor force are employed in the agricultural sector. So I would like now to talk more about what Angeliki was talking about, which is Egypt's domestic preferences and priorities when it comes to migration. So Egypt and the EU actually have a mutually beneficial framework when it comes to migration. Egyptian government views migration as well as other countries in the region, views migration as a key driver for development and foreign exchange earnings. So remittances provide huge support to Egyptian livelihoods and is responsible for the elevation of poverty. And for that sake, Egypt is very welcoming to further cooperation with the EU in regards to migration. So basically, Egypt is currently now pursuing a policy of deterrence by controlling its borders and managing the borders. But also recently, there has been a new development which Angeliki mentioned, which is a new asylum law has been drafted and passed by the parliament, which changes things a bit for Egypt when it comes to the integration of migrant communities. So historically speaking, the UNHCR is the main entity responsible for the migrant community in Egypt. But recently, the government in this law mentioned that it wants to shift some of this responsibility to the Egyptian government. And also there was mention of the possibility of providing Egyptian nationality to certain migrants, which is something that is very new. So this is actually mainly as a result of its cooperation with the EU, because previously speaking, Egypt was not really interested in pursuing this kind of approach. But definitely, if anything, this is a major proof of the kind of partnership that the EU and Egypt have. So as you all might know, Egypt and the EU signed a strategic partnership, which outlines a comprehensive migration government. And it's a huge investment in Egyptian economy, with basically 7.4 billion financial and 7.4 billion euros in financial and investment support. And actually 200 million euros are dedicated to migration management. So for Egypt, this is a great opportunity, especially with the increase of pressure of migrant communities and the increase of refugees and asylum seekers in Egypt. There is an increased need in financial support in order to host these communities, and then also by extension, limit the secondary migration of these communities to Europe. And another thing that also Egypt and the EU are working on or cooperating on when it comes to migration actually is vocational and technical training of Egyptians. So for example, we have Egyptian-German Job Center, which is aimed at skills matching and increasing the upskilling Egyptian youth. And the aim was to provide them with better job opportunities in Egypt or even abroad. And also very recently, we also have talk of an Italian Egyptian job center similar to the German Egyptian Job Center. So this is all a focus on specifically technical skills of Egyptians, and this is the main priority for Egyptian government, which is labor migration. Labor migration provides a great opportunity to elevate the unemployment in Egypt, and I would say it's the main priority when it comes to this partnership. And another thing that I would also like to mention is a lot of the financial assistance to Egypt is aimed at providing further support to Egypt in order to provide better support as a host for host communities, especially since with the increase of asylum seekers and refugees in Egypt, there has been an increase in negative public sentiment. And this is something that is being addressed right now. And it's necessary it's necessary to address this issue as it becomes less and less attractive for asylum seekers and migrants to stay in Egypt for example, with an increase in racism or any other negative sentiments. So in conclusion, I think that the Egyptian and the EU framework for labor migration is mutually benefit, but it could benefit more from a further inclusion of labor migration as a core pillar for this cooperation. And another thing, I believe that further investment in whether it's through projects or partnerships, further investment in the gaps that refugee communities face in Egypt, such as healthcare, education, and employment, which have a lot of barriers, will really benefit also increasing Egypt's attractiveness as a destination country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amina. Well, you spread out really a lot of different topics and questions, which all fall under the migration headline, and I'm sure we will have a lot of questions afterwards, or in the discussion part of the activities. For now, I would like to invite two more perspectives into the discussion. First of all, I'm really happy that we have Niki Georgiou from Greece, from Athens, lawyer from Athens in the NGO Equal Rights Beyond Borders. You're a German-Greek human rights organization. You do advocacy, but you also consult individuals on their rights. So it would be really interesting to hear from you. How do you assess the situation? What was new, or what are things that have probably changed in your work in the last 2 or 3 years? How do you assess the situation? Niki, are you there? A bit frozen. Now she's gone.
Let's see whether she recovers.
Yeah.
If not, I just say we continue with Raphael and see if Niki's coming back and her internet stabilizes, right? Yeah. Annette? Change around.
Genau, kleiner Change of plans. Ja, sie hatte, glaube ich, vorher schon Probleme.
Yeah, I think we'll have a change of plans. Niki has had problems already. Dear Raphael, Bossong, I'm happy that you're with us. His deputy group leader since 2016 at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation for Research and Politics. versed in migration issues. You said that the paradigm shift on the side of the EU, of which we've already been talking, means nothing new, just old things taken up again. We have a new Mediterranean commissioner, and we have a very ambitious, as they say, plan for the Mediterranean. Angeliki already talked about the communalities, which they have worked out in the study. How do you see all this? What is your take on it? Thank you very much. I hope that we can also hear the report from Greece later on when the connection is reestablished. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. We have heard an interesting situation report, and I think maybe I can say why I think that in Germany these things matter, we have mentioned. But before I talk about the new government in Germany, I think we should remember something else. Our general situation in which we are at the moment, that was touched upon at the beginning, and the perception, not necessarily among the NGOs, is that yes, there are still a lot of difficult challenges before us, but the path is relatively clear. We have the pact from the last year, the agreement, and for many years, but especially for the last 2 years, we have been concluding more parallel agreements with third countries. And in the political perception, it is said that these agreements work better and better. This may be a contradiction to how you see it, but that's the impression. There is a paper of the European People's Party, and it is from April, early April, and in this paper it is written that with Tunisia and other countries, and now also with Egypt, we have agreements in force, and we have reduced irregular migration by 60%, thanks to the agreement with Tunisia. That's at least what is said publicly. And in this framework, as has already been alluded to, we have now the proposal for a new Mediterranean strategy, and possibly shortly further proposals by the European Commission, who wants to express that we are on the right path, that the situation is getting calmer, Frontex figures are going down, we just have to stay the course. And before this background, I think it's important now, interesting now, to look what the reality is with this, because the relationships are complicated and the picture cannot be so black and white. We cannot say we have a new deal and that's it. We have to see how acceptable and realistic it is to say, well, with short variations, we continue the way we have been doing things up to now. That direction is correct. We just have to extend these instruments in a sensible way and stabilize the situation. That could be one way to see things, or you could say, well, as legally what we do is relatively problematic. There are still violations of human rights, and the foundations we're building all this on are not stable. We have the example Tunisia. We'll have to see whether the example of Tunisia will continue in the future. And then Egypt, the country seems stable seen from the outside, but internally there are many crises, and the region is difficult. There is Syria. Well, when you look at Syria from the outside, you have the impression that there is progress, but then in the entire region, in Lebanon, the situation is very fragile. Then you have Turkey. We got used to Erdogan in the last couple of years or few years, that Erdogan is a difficult partner, but somehow we get along with him. And yes, I would say perhaps it's possible to continue like this. But then with the repressions we have now in Turkey, with what Erdogan does, also externally, you may maybe reach an era where you cannot rely on Erdogan and Turkey in the future, and can hope for Erdogan to stop migration flows. I don't want to talk too lengthily, but I think in this region there is, as I've already said, the situation that the background is that the EU says officially we have the pact, we just have to implement it. But there are still a lot of problems which are not solved. And therefore, we do not know whether next year we can really start with the implementation of the pact in reality in the East or in Southeast Europe. Maybe some countries will say, no, we don't implement the plan. We rather try our own national policies. Because this is something people sometimes say that Italy now is dealing with Albania in order to maybe then stop with the plan. And the question is also whether it would be beneficial for Greece if they really implement the plan neatly in the next year, or would other strategies be more advantageous for Greece? In Germany, we have had the court decision that recognized asylum seekers who arrive in Germany from Greece, but have in Greece a protection title, are not returned to Greece according to German jurisdiction or case law. But now it is said that it should be possible at least for men without a family. So there are the old wounds opening up again, and we just pass on the bucket. Inside the EU, outside the EU, we just pass on the bucket to others and hope that others can then solve the problem, that it's not our problem anymore. This was just a short overview. What I wanted to express mainly is why it is so important to get a good impression, a good picture of this region, because otherwise you cannot really imagine what can be done in the future, whether this path we have internally decided upon in the EU is doable. Maybe there are surprises waiting for us. Maybe the conflicts we have had in the New Year's will start afresh. And now I'm really looking forward to hearing from Greece. Maybe I can say two things before I stop. With the current EU presidency in Poland, with whom migration policy is difficult. We will see how the new German federal government will cooperate with Poland. Afterwards, we will have Denmark and Cyprus as the presidency of the EU Council. Well, the presidency is not everything, but I think those countries, Denmark, Greece, Cyprus, will definitely need to make new proposals. We have to expect that, and they will sell them as brilliant ideas for the neighborhood policy in their region. We have to be prepared for this, and I think the reports that you've been producing are an important contribution to this. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Raphael. I'm sure that that's a good bridge to the discussion that we'll be having afterwards. A few people have asked on chaos. You talked about a pact, and there have been some agreements. Can you perhaps explain? Yes, I know that's just the European speak. So there's a pact on migration and asylum, which is a huge reform package which was passed in the spring of last year and which will be implemented by June next year. And then there have been further debates. Part of it is probably being reworded. The EU will use new terminology and designate safe third countries and would like to swiftly agree on those safe third countries. And it will be interesting to see which of the countries will be on the list of the safe third countries. And then there's been an announcement in last autumn. The new EU Commission will also work on a new pact for the Mediterranean. There's a new admin responsible for MENA states, and we're just waiting to see what will come of it. But perhaps based on the signals we get from Italy, they would like to continue with the successful steering of migration policy, but they would also like to insist on their specific interests like energy policy and things like that. So is that just hot air, or will there be a new policy in the making? We don't know yet. Looking at it rather soberly, the partnership agreements of the past 20 years unfortunately never really worked out. But those are the two agreements or pacts that I talked about earlier on. Okay, thank you very much. I think that was quite useful for the people listening to us. When we prepared this meeting, we thought that perhaps we should onboard someone from the European Union to really put us in the picture of what they are developing. But it's quite hard for the moment to find all the information on what they are planning. But we have you with us, Raphael, Bossong, and that's great. Let's move to Athens and Niki. I think Niki changed her computer.
Das ist super, dass du wieder bei uns bist. Hallo. Ich hatte dich.
Yeah.
Ich hatte dich schon.
Like,
yes.
Like I had an electricity cut, but like in the meantime it came again, but internet is still not. I think soon I will also have internet. I'm connected now through my phone. Very sorry for this. Well, it
no
happens.
problem. I think the connectivity and the voice is perfect, so no problem.
Yeah,
so
great.
We're eager to hear from you.
So maybe not to lose time and like get connected again through my computer. Maybe Max can facilitate a bit with the thank you with the with sharing the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for the invitation. I read with great interest the reports and heard also with the same interest your interesting presentations. I'm Niki Georgiou. I'm a lawyer and coordinator of the non-governmental organization Equal Rights Beyond Borders, Greek and German organization. We provide free legal assistance to asylum seekers, migrants and refugees in Greece. We operate mostly in Athens, but also on the border islands of Chios, Kos and Kleros. My input will be short and will be limited to the policy recommendations for Greece, which were 1, boost migration diplomacy, 2, promote humane border policies, and 3, prioritize integration. So I will start with the first one. When raising migration diplomacy, it should be reminded that, and I will try also to speak slow for the interpreters, so let me know if I speak. Yeah, I will try my best to speak very slow. So when raising migration diplomacy, it should be reminded that most efforts to govern migration through diplomacy and deals have not always succeeded in Greece. The most known example is the EU-Turkey Joint Declaration of March 2016, policy of denying protection to refugees entering Greece from Turkey and return them to a so-called safer country, has led to summary rejections of applications for international protection as inadmissible, leading to thousands of refugees being deprived of any protection. But this never worked. Few were returned, and there was a total stop from Turkey, like accepting returnees from Greece in March 2020. This deal has placed all this big number of rejected applicants in the status of undocumented migrants in conditions of social exclusion, economic exhaustion, homelessness, with the risk even for prolonged detention. On the second recommendation, humane border policy, of course, we agree that human border policy is key for governing any migration. And we are in a point where we can say with certainty that pushbacks are not alleged pushbacks, but are a harsh reality for Greece, with many deaths occurring at our island and mainland border. Also, the events of 2020 at the Evros-Turkish border cannot be characterized as a game changer with any kind of positive connotation, but was rather a sad moment with many, many violations of the border, with people even being injured, and we also had deaths. Let's not forget about this. Besides, there are hundreds of reports and testimonies pointing to this. The pushback reality was even admitted by the European Court of Human Rights by its recent judgment on January 2025, the case ARA versus Greece, where the court explicitly referred to a systematic practice of pushbacks by the Greek authorities of third country nationals from the Evros region to Turkey. And on that specific case, the court ruled as well that the applicant was indeed pushed back, was illegally detained, and the Greek authorities failed to conduct an effective criminal investigation and archived the applicant's criminal complaint despite the prima facie evidence. It is noted that to date, the Greek authorities systematically deny the practice of pushbacks at the Greek-Turkish borders. The court's judgment confirms that pushbacks at the Greek borders constitute a systematic practice of the Greek authorities. And this has also been documented for several years in numerous reports by international, European, and national organizations, as well as in the complaints of the victims of pushbacks. Our organization receives this kind of complaints, and we are in general in contact with clients who have also given such testimonies. The court in the above case found, among other violations, a violation of Article 3, which prohibits torture, inhumane and degrading treatment. So I found this like an important input and wanted to share this with you. On the third recommendation on integration, like the reality of Greece is quite depicted on the report for Greece. Any kinds of benefits, such as accommodation or material support available throughout the asylum process, are immediately seized upon grant of international protection. The deadline given to the beneficiaries to actually vacate their reception places in camps after obtaining a positive decision is 30 days. And this deadline is too short for people to all of a sudden organize their lives, find accommodation, find a job. They are kicked out very often even before they receive their identity cards. And even vulnerable cases are evicted from the camps. And we have many, many cases where people end up being in the streets, being homeless. So if we have, let's say, a high recognition rate in Greece, this situation concerns a lot of people. Economic situation in Greece is in general bad, and integration efforts are not on the radar, which makes a lot of people wanting to leave Greece, obviously. The Greek system is indeed a jungle, hard to navigate even for citizens. To work legally, people need a social security number. To get a social security number, people need an identity card, but sometimes this is not even possible to obtain. And so we have even like recognized refugees who had been living for some years now in Greece. They decide to leave because they understand that it is extremely difficult and bureaucratic to get Greek citizenship. This discourages them, and they decide to leave at the end, even if they had already built their lives here. The system hence is too complicated for persons to master, and there is no real integration programs, even though foreseen by EU lately some job fairs by UNHCR. But let's not forget that UNHCR also has recently lost quite some funding. There is no effective access to integration systems, such as Helios accommodation program, that is limited only to a few slots also. Rule of law crisis in Greece does not only contain breaches of human rights, violations of protection seekers. Threats to the rule of law include a major surveillance scandal, allegedly implicating the government in the targeting hacking of journalists' devices, government interference with the media, abusive lawsuits against journalists and activists, and an overall unsafe working environment for journalists. Two unresolved murders of journalists in 10 years underscore the risks they face. In addition, under this government, the authorities have used the criminal justice system to threaten civil society groups and activists. NGOs have to be registered in a specific NGO registry imposed by the Ministry of Migration and Asylum. Otherwise, their operation can be suspended. The requirements for this registration are strict and are not easy to meet, putting a huge burden on NGOs. Even the expert Council on NGO Law of the Council of Europe issued an expert opinion in 2020 on the requirements imposed on NGOs, saying that these are considered to be linked to efforts to shrink the space of civil society. And several UN special rapporteurs condemned the criminalization of human rights defenders, and we can see this in the everyday life, that every colleague is under pressure, taking constant risks when working on this field. So the measures taken have a deterrent effect on the activities of NGOs, and this also acts as a deterrent to the ability of NGOs to support refugees and other migrants. Thank you very much. Hope it was useful.
Auf jeden Fall. Vielen Dank, Niki. Jetzt könnte man sicherlich noch mal eine Runde machen, auch mit Angeliki. Du hast dich ja, und Amina, du hast dich an einigen Fragen auch auf den Report bezogen. Aber ich glaube, es ist jetzt wirklich auch Zeit, die Diskussion zu öffnen. Und da gebe ich weiter an Max. Was sind denn für Fragen angekommen? In welche Richtung soll es gehen? Weil es gibt ja von hier aus sehr viele Pfade, die wir weiterverfolgen können. Aber was interessiert die Teilnehmer und Teilnehmerinnen?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. We'll just be switching to English so we can all understand each other now for the Q&A. Received quite a few questions, both in German and English. And I want to start with something that is actually part of kind of the German discussion quite a lot, but I think it alludes to a bigger problem with this, the top question with the most votes got from a person asking, so why do you use the term irregular migration? Because at least in Germany, this is a term used by the far right parties to dispute the legitimacy of the rights of refugees, for example, and generally like migration policy. So the big question about, and you all kind of alluded to it, that there, whether you use the term irregular migration or not, but there is something else that is the legal one or a regular one. So so maybe because this is kind of touching on also on kind of the German, also language situation. So maybe Raphael. So there's a big discussion in Germany, at least, probably on the left and the NGO circles, how to speak about, migration, how to speak about irregularity in migration, and what's the opposite of it, and how to speak about it. So as a scientist, how do you speak about this? So is it just that, in English, this is a common term, or do you also see that there is a problem in the way we speak about migration that it then actually affects policy? Because that's at the end the question that it's about.
Okay, well, I'm not here to make the language police, but and we're not an NGO in that sense. I mean, we are a foundation, but we don't have a sort of agenda to stand for in that sense. But personally, yes, I use the term irregular migration. I understand that there is a view of some actors that even that term is going too far in already denying the right to move and to right to migrate. Because of course, it is also true that many people around the world, be they actual refugees, but also many other categories of people have not the opportunity to use regular ways of moving and moving to Europe or Western countries, and that they are by that in a way forced to resort to alternatives, and that we create this irregularity. Yeah, I mean, I put this in these terms. Yeah, so it doesn't mean, but I use the term because I think it's still considering the whole setting, the somewhat more neutral, if I may say, in my view, term, because it's contrasting regular versus irregular in terms of an administrative view. And the more problematic term is certainly the illegal migration term, which I would say is rather the term that is more moving to the right, not necessarily to the far right, but of course, definitely to the far right, but also parties to the center right. They also use this term very regularly. And here, obviously, using the term illegality already creates not just the view of administrative problem, but criminal problem. And it is unfortunately a matter of fact that this term has become definitely entrenched in the discourse, as also in the center of the debate. But this is how I would handle it. And as I said, but everybody is still free to use the terms of their choice. I would think under these circumstances, irregular migration is still a sort of relatively neutral middle ground, if that helps.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Angeliki, you kind of you brought it up first. This kind of question was directed to you, and you basically said, look, what's actually missing, and you basically gave the explanation. What's missing is the legal route. So maybe we can speak a bit about legal routes, because this was one of the kind of similarity I felt that you all kind of shared. That look, if you wanna really help people as well, and people seeking refuge, then we need to have legal routes. And Amina spoke a bit about kind of positive examples in Egypt, like the German and Italian kind of offices. So maybe Angeliki first, and then Amina. Can we speak about what do we actually need to do, or what kind of Europe needs to do to create those kind of legal pathways for migration? And is that actually part of the plans that Raphael kind of outlined in like this pact and all of this? So what's about legal migration? We talk about a lot about this for the last 10, 15 years, but has there really been big changes in there?
So the optimist would probably answer yes. The pessimist in me will have to answer no. The one thing to keep in mind about legal migration routes, and there are two types broadly, two categories broadly, but I think this distinction can be a little bit problematic, is we have legal pathways for refugees. The most common is resettlement, which obviously has stagnated in the last few years. And we talk about legal labor pathways also for people who want to come in for labor purposes. Now, increasingly, these two are being bridged in some cases. acknowledging that refugees have skills and capacity, and they can be brought in legally also, with the intent to not only provide them with protection, but also link them with the labor market, which would be the more sustainable also option for their settlement. But in both cases, I would say that progress has been very slow. I know Amina mentioned some of the pilot projects, and there have been several actually pilot projects that have taken place through different frameworks, the talent partnerships, the compacts in the past, across different countries, especially in Africa. The problem with legal pathways is not all the member states are committed to them. The numbers are quite small, especially in the pilot projects. We're talking about a few hundred at best. The level of need that exists out there is much, much larger. And they run on a funding cycle that resembles a little bit EU projects. So they're funded for 2 or 3 years, and then the funding runs out, and the question is, what do you do next? That's not to say that they're not a great starting point, or at least a good starting point. But in order for us to boost and expand legal pathways, and for me, this is where migration diplomacy comes in. Migration diplomacy is not only about making deals that seek deterrence. Migration diplomacy is also about making deals that allow for legal pathways for significant numbers of people that can come in, can receive training, can work in the labor market in a way that respects their rights, and at the same time allows them to move, should they obviously wish to, and in principle should link with investment taking back to the countries of origin, so that when they return, they're able to actually be absorbed in the local labor market. And this is obviously very much relevant for labor migration, legal labor migration, than it is for refugees, for a completely different category. And this is something that we have not seen. The level of investment that is needed right now is not happening. These pilot projects, as I said, are focusing on small numbers, and even ideas like the training, for example, that Amina mentioned regarding Egyptian workers, upskilling and reskilling, which is great. And it is a positive step. That also requires that you have a shift in the domestic labor market, so that the people who have been upskilled and reskilled can actually find a job. And in themselves, legal pathways can facilitate in reducing some of the need, can provide safety for people that are fleeing and need access to safety quickly, and in a manner that doesn't endanger their lives, if we're talking about refugees. But they're not a short-term solution, legal pathways. In order for them to be effective, they need to be part of a very long-term strategy, which is where politics comes in. And politicians are, unwilling to make long-term strategies beyond their election cycles. So,
thank you. I have hands from Amina and then Raphael.
Hello, should I go first? I'll go first.
Yes.
So I like to echo everything Angeliki said regarding the numbers, for example, like of labor migrants and how successful it is because of numbers are so little. And another thing I wanted to point out is that, especially in the case of Egypt and Italy specifically, a lot of the Egyptian irregular migrants that go to Italy are being absorbed mainly into the informal economy in Italy. And as I was doing my research, there's a lot of studies about, well, do we need to address this informal sector and how it is the reason why a lot of, for example, less skilled workers from Egypt go, because they know that they would find jobs in this informal sector, and there is definitely, I would say, a need for them as well. So it's kind of a two-way street. And another thing that I wanted to mention, but might not be exactly related to the question, but we have also specific, I'm always talking about Egypt. So in the case of Egypt, you have whether it's Egyptians migrating irregularly to be absorbed into the informal markets, and you have the other end, which is the most skilled of Egyptian workers moving to countries, specifically in the healthcare field, that kind of thing, which also has implications for Egypt's own maybe economical development when it comes to, for example, the phenomenon of brain drain and that kind of thing. So there's definitely multifacets when it comes to exploring like legal pathways and irregular pathways and all these kind of things. Definitely, it's not black and white.
Thank you. Then Raphael?
Yeah, I mean, I know with the other questions, I basically wanted to take it a little bit on a broader level. So as Angeliki just rightly said, there are of course different forms of legal migration, and all these ideas are not new, but to just say two very broad things about the one about refugees and the other about labor. So in Germany, we just had, again, before the election and around the election, this debate about that basically we should, some conservatives said, end the right of individual asylum. So basically not allow spontaneous asylum applications anymore of people who come just like that, and replace it by generous resettlement quotas. Yeah? So basically, allegedly following the example of Australia or Canada, and just expand refugee resettlement approaches. So this would be a whole different panel and discussion to discuss it all, but I think the irony, and not to be too cynical here, is that just as some leading conservatives were making this argument, they come into the government and now end the remaining resettlement programs that there are. And there are just a few thousand coming from Afghanistan, and also, of course, there are some additional smaller ones. But so the kind of credibility talk gap, even if you stand for a paradigmatic change, is bigger than ever. And globally, of course, resettlement, looking at the US, is in a terrible state, worse than ever, rather than the future of refugee protection, at least at this point in time, unfortunately, if one is realistic. On the labor side, we just heard correctly, we have lots and lots of pilots. We have also, since ever already, huge demand in the informal sector. And I think there is two interesting things to watch in the future, apart from whatever goes on in official declarations and the pact here and the pact there. The one is really, I mean, we've been talking about the demographic shift forever, and that this is really going to bite, and it's going to bite the next year, and then it's the 2030s, and when the baby boomers go into pension and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's going to bite soon, and in different countries already pretty hard. And in Germany, at least, and I think in some other European countries, maybe less so in Italy, we've been using other forms of migration more, particularly from Central and Eastern Europe, but this potential is also gone. And so there is a lot more demand to have other sources. And the question is, where do these people come from? Are we going to turn to India? Are we going to turn more to North Africa again, and so on? So there really is a big, open, not outspoken public thing that we need, definitely not just talk about the need for labor migration, but we actually have to do it in big numbers and not from European countries. And I think when and how this is going to happen in European societies is going to be very tense in the next few years. And lastly, I think it's also very interesting to see what's going to happen in the US, because like wherever you do migration research, everybody will tell you, yes, you know, looking at right-wing or left-wing governments, in the end, there is, after all, this labor migration need. And whether it's done officially or unofficially, it's just happening. And for example, if you look at Italy or countries like in the US before, you know, if you really wanted to tackle irregular or illegal migration, depending on your verbs, you would have to go after the employers and to the people who give the work in the formal or informal sector. But this doesn't happen also under right-wing governments. Yeah. So this is why it continues, and migrants take the risks. So the Trump administration right now is, for the first time, at least at this point in time, an administration that tries to do that, what they say. You know, we all hate it, but they are actually doing this. And they really are trying to get rid of a lot of irregular workers in the economy. The question is, can they actually sustain that purely economically? And I think depending on how that plays out, I think this will also influence some right-wing or conservatives in Europe, and who either then think, oh, Trump did it and we can do it too, or who will see yet one more time there is a lot of talk, and then in the end, reality bites, and we have to find a different way of dealing with this. So sorry, that was very general, but I think it's also something that will definitely influence the future of southern relations between, you know, Europe and the Mediterranean region beyond all official talk. You know, there are the hard structural changes happening. And I think that's going to be the decisive factor.
Thank you. I think one point here in the question was, you know, when you mentioned, you know, generally about, you know, the fragility, especially of the Eastern Mediterranean, with everything that's happening there and all the angles, people also started to ask, look, but you know, now UNHCR is a lot of receiving a lot of funding from the USAID, so United States Environmental Agency, that has been abolished by the Trump administration. So when we speak about fragility, so maybe also towards Amina or everyone who kind of can comment on that. So, you know, in our invitation, we kind of spoke about, you know, the situation is explosive. So is that maybe the cut of funding, the 100% cut of funding at USAID, is that actually, could that in the year to come actually further destabilize it? So if money is from the US is going away, what is the effect on Egypt and the region in a whole? But maybe Egypt first.
So could you please maybe paraphrase the question, because I find it a bit wide scale, just for the Egyptian perspective of not.
So I mean, you also mentioned that basically a lot of the settlement for migrants, refugees in Egypt is done by UNHCR.
Yes.
And UNHCR receives a lot of funding also from USAID, and Trump is now, well, has basically destroyed USAID. So is that when we talk about fragility of a system, you know, in terms of, you know, so for how long can Egypt hold the deterrence, for example? Is that, so what effect will that have if basically UNHCR funding breaks away, and as it seems now? So
yeah, well, thank you for phrasing it like that. Well, definitely, this is definitely expected, and it's currently having a great effect, especially on the kind of pressure the Egyptian government is facing. So you have, for example, one of the projects is a project focused on access to healthcare to refugees and asylum seekers, which is cooperating the UNHCR and WHO, and also I believe it's also in part at least funded by USAID. So this is definitely, for example, going to have a big effect on this area, which is, for example, access to healthcare. Of course, there are a lot of other projects in general that are occurring in Egypt. Most of the support that refugees and asylum seekers are receiving in Egypt are from funding. So whether it's from the USAID, which is now, as you have mentioned, a huge problem, or the funding from Europe. So this does really make this sustainability maybe of the approach to this migration governance like put in question, because yeah, like what's going to happen in the future is the EU going to consistently provide this kind of financial assistance to ensure that there's no secondary movements. So it's really kind of a question mark right now, and definitely a very unstable situation to begin with, but we will see more in the future.
Thank you. I'm looking through the questions here. I think when we spoke about legal migration, this is, or regular migration in that sense that we talked about. So when I look through it, I think, you know, it's like Thomas, for example, but also Mary here asked, and I think that's an important question. So, you know, what can we do to help countries to improve living conditions in countries where many migrants are forced to leave from? Not in order to reduce immigration, but from a humanitarian enablement point of view, what needs to change the political mindset? And this is, I think the mindset question is a very, you know, it's even maybe a philosophical question, but as you all said, those countries we are speaking about, those four, they are really thinking this in terms of deterrence, quite a lot of it, and not in terms of humanitarian viewpoint. So would you agree with Mary that, you know, humanitarian issues and questions are actually less important, and as she interprets it, and is there a way to change this, or is this still this be hard, deter, and get money for it to keep the people there? Because this is, in the end of the day, that's what many of the pacts are, as you described them. So maybe I think we have lost Niki. No, you're still there, Niki. Maybe because that would be an interesting question for Niki, but also I can take Angeliki if you like, or Amina on that question. So Mary's question on the humanitarian angle of it. Yeah, Amina, please.
Okay. Well, just as my previous answer was talking about preventing secondary movements, but I guess from a humanitarian perspective, something that I would like to also mention is that I think one of the biggest factors, for example, for asylum seekers and refugees, maybe in Egypt, based on people I've talked to, is that domestically, there is a lot of negative rhetoric about asylum seekers and refugees, and it's also being framed like this by stakeholders, that they are obviously adding to the pressure, and they are responsible for a lot of the challenges that we are facing. So I definitely think if we're going to approach a more humanitarian perspective, it's necessary to address this issue of social cohesion and integration of the refugees and asylum seekers in the communities that they are in, because they are, all of them, like most of the areas that they are in or heavily populated, are areas that are also very heavily populated with Egyptians. And I believe there's a huge gap when it comes to this integration, even just from a social or humanitarian perspective. There's too much rhetoric about everything else and less of that. So that's maybe one angle.
Thank you. And I want to raise before Raphael, a hand on that, and then I will just raise another citizen question. Raphael, please.
I mean, I don't know whether Angeliki want to come in, or I mean, I already said something, but I mean, maybe also it's a question of mine to throw to the mix. You know, not to be too idealistic here, but I do agree here to the sense that, you know, in Germany we have a lot of this debate. We need to talk about the successes of, you know, we made it and we integrated, while there is still a lot of also difficulties and challenges to overcome. But in those countries, at least from the German perspective, both in the neighborhood, but also in countries like Greece, we don't hear any of those stories that, you know, any of the contributions these migrants made to the societies, and that there is still a room for them to actually be accommodated there. All that we hear is that, you know, every country just tries to make its own system as unattractive as possible. And I think it would be interesting to hear whether there is a bit more nuance to this debate also in other countries. But to come to the original question, I think the challenge here is that, you know, when you talk to policymakers, and not all of them, but I think many of them have the sense that, you know, we had this talk about root causes and prevention, and nothing of that really works. And in the end, all that really works is just these kind of simple deals. You know, I mean, I'm deliberately being polemical here, but it's very, very hard to tell a different story to them that convinces them. That they say, look, you know, we did it differently here, and it actually helped people in their home country or in the country of transit. Sometimes this works, and sorry, maybe it's controversial, with the EU-Turkey deal, and not because the EU-Turkey deal was just, you know, pushing people back to Turkey, but because you could say the EU gave money to Turkey, which then benefited Syrians in Turkey with schooling and some social services. Now, that's the only story I know where this actually reached some level of political visibility. But when you look at other countries, it's not at all a story of that. And okay, with Egypt, the problem is, or the project of the EU is a bit bigger than that. But in the end, we don't have a narrative to show that these other investments actually bear fruit. And all that seems to work is just buying boats and sort of surveillance of the borders. That's all. And I wish there was a better narrative to show for policymakers, to say that these investments can be more broad and actually benefit the whole of society in the countries that we'd want to stabilize.
That's a very good one. Angeliki, please.
Thank you. So I actually I agree with Raphael. I think the narrative is lacking, but to come back also to your original question, because for me these two are linked. The humanitarian issue, sure. I mean, I don't think anybody on this panel would say let's not prioritize the humanitarian issues. But having said that, what we do know is that this is not sufficient to create the narrative and change the political mindset, because change the political mindset and also change the mindset potentially of the society. It's not, I think, accidental that we're seeing an increase in anti-immigrant sentiments. We're seeing a push for restrictions and exclusions, especially when the economy is problematic. These two, there's a correlation between these two, whether we're talking about a country like Egypt, for example, or Lebanon, whether we're talking about Greece during the financial crisis, whether we're talking about Turkey. There is a correlation with the socioeconomic and political situation in a country and how it can respond to migration, and how it's willing to respond to migration. So prioritizing humanitarian issues in the third countries is critical, but to do so in a sustainable manner, in order to also change the mindset and show these countries that it's the humanitarian side that needs to be prioritized rather than deterrence. That means that, and it comes back to what I also said before, to what Raphael also suggested with the narrative, we need long-term strategies that are implemented in the long term, not for a 5-year cycle or a 3-year cycle. We need a long-term strategy of decades. This is not something that governments are in a position to do, and this is not something that politicians, but even the public is necessarily willing to accept. The level of investment, not just financial, but also political investment, the back and forth that it requires, the level of monitoring that it requires. Because sure, the deals, for example, and again, I have been in a lot of these policy discussions, Raphael is right. For policymakers, they're considered successful, but that's because the day-to-day violations of human rights and in many cases the suffering that these deals have caused do not reach them directly, right? They're at the completely other end of the table. They will hear about these in reports from us, from occasionally from journalists, from NGOs, but it's not part of their day-to-day reality. It's the reality of a specific group that is experiencing the hardships that these deals are imposing. And you also have, on the other end, situations where they have been improved by these deals because money has been poured into the local economies. The Syrians in Turkey, again, are a prime example. For a period of time, the EU-Turkey deal was catastrophic for the migrants on the Greek islands. But for the Syrians in Turkey, for a short period of time, was actually hugely beneficial because the money did go into the economy to support the Syrian integration. But the money at some point stopped. They were absorbed. And you have a Turkish economy that was unable to sustain the presence of the Syrian population in its territory. And you had the rise of anti-immigrant sentiments and the desire to push the Syrians away. So there is a correlation between all these issues. We can't just say we need, it's a question of whether we're prioritizing human rights or humanitarian issues. There are practical components that actually affect how how we can guarantee the respect and implementation of a human rights framework.
And in a way, I mean, I completely agree. And then we are in a vicious circle here, right? Because as long as we don't have this long-term strategy that, shows and turns the narrative around and also considers social justice in arrival countries, for example, for the everyone in the population is key. Like if you improve the socioeconomic situation, you see that in Germany, for example, where people have a good life, where there are strong regions, the anti-immigrant sentiment is lower. Where there are very few refugees, there the and the situation is bad in rural economies, for example. In Germany, then you have a very high anti-immigration sentiment. So there's also kind of this is of course multifaceted, but the socioeconomic point is very important, as you all made clear. And I want to kind of try to close and wrap it up a bit with one question, you know, that I want to pose to kind of all of you, and then also hand over to Annette. But we're now 10 years since 2015, at least for Germany and a lot of European countries. 2015, a lot of Syrians coming in, and you know, we all remember pre-Brexit those images. There were of course disinformation, but there was, you know, 2015 is for European, also for the European far right, but generally for European politics, has been kind of the year where a lot has changed, and you have the feeling that, you know, from there on it pushed to the right. So when we now look ahead 10 years, so we're now 10 years after, assuming, for example, that we get again numbers as when the Syrian war happened, having to make their way into safety and towards the European Union. Is the Union now better prepared to do this? And, you know, what does happen to the European EU politics and politics in member states if that situation kind of is now repeated 10 years after? Yeah. And so where are we now 10 years after? Are we ready for that? Is Europe more resilient? Also politically difficult question. Raphael, maybe?
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Well, I mean, if we're lucky, we have a few years before we can weather the next storm. If it happened in the next year or two, I think we would be really screwed, to be honest. Maybe we have a sort of a period where new systems and this new pact of migration asylum is super controversial, and it's certainly not going to solve many problems, but at least it provides a work plan for countries to somewhat work again together a little bit and to modernize some structures. Again, I'm not trying to say it's all good, but if we, in this period when we're transiting to this sort of new arrangement, had another huge crisis, I think then the impulse to go, okay, let's just do it national, would be huge. And we were already very close to that in Germany in the last election. So whether in 3 or 4 years we are a bit more resilient, we'll see. Maybe by the time, as I said before, there is also a changed discourse about the need for labor migration that really reached the broad population and not just the elites. So perhaps, but I think what we are likely to see, if I have a crystal ball, is that, you know, again, I'm not trying to be too pessimistic here or a foregone conclusion, but there is a movement to kind of sketch out a new sort of gray zone that on the one hand, we will maintain the right to asylum on paper and also try to do something to sort of reduce some of the human rights abuses that we've seen in the last year, and at the same time say, but look, we have to structure the system yet more narrow so that people will have less means to come here, you know, the deals, plus, you know, like the US already under Biden did, that we're going to say, okay, maybe we can take a few thousand per day, but if it's more than that, we just shut the border. And that's already what Greece has done in times and what Poland is doing and Eastern European countries. And I think this is going to be becoming permanent. And is that resilience? Probably not, at least not for the European neighborhood countries, which may have to bear the brunt of a new crisis. But I think that's what's going to come. That you know, asylum system is not going to completely end, but we can make it a lot more, yet more conditional, and yet more, you know, this is our maximum capacity, and after that, don't ask us to do it anymore. And I think this is a difficult and challenging time to come. And last point here, to put it over to Amina, we have also scare scenarios of what could happen or what couldn't happen. At the moment, it's comparatively quieter, but I've been already years ago in some internal meetings where there was this horror scenario. What if Egypt collapses? 50% of the population under 18. And I don't actually know what the current population number of Egypt is, but there was the sense that, we've managed to control various neighboring countries, but Egypt, if that would be wrong, we would have been completely out of control. Maybe that's wrong, but yeah, I think I heard from actual people in the German administration at some point.
Thank you. Amina, wanna chime in on that, and then I give over to Annette.
Yes, I'm definitely familiar with the rhetoric about Egypt collapsing, possibly. I think the main thing that to look out for is maybe the instability in Egypt's neighboring countries. So it depends on how things are going to, I think this is what's being talked about the most, how things are going to look like in Sudan. Is the conflict, what's it going to look like in the near future? Same thing with Gaza, same thing with Syria. So we have a lot of things going on right now, but I think the main thing that it's kind of people in Egypt at least are waiting to see, okay, what's going to happen next. It's kind of how these different situations and conflicts and all these are going to look like. So I think this would definitely maybe have a big role to play in what Raphael was mentioning.
Thank you, Amina. And I hand over this to Annette to close it up because we are running out of time. Annette.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and
Niki, now.
Yeah, sorry for my
yes,
it's an advance for today. So I think that after only 2 sentences, that after 10 years, I think that we should also ask ourselves what kind of policy exists. Because is it a policy to be ready or a policy to deter? So I think that it's mostly about not a question of being able, but not wanting. So do we want to be ready? And yeah, so I would answer this question by a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Annette.
Ja, ich hab's mir schon fast gedacht, am Ende landet man immer bei den Narrativen.
Yes, I was already thinking that in the end you always end up with the narratives.
Das ist sicherlich ein wichtiges
Well, it's certainly an important topic, an important question, and sometimes it's despairing. Because also in this discussion it was actually so that sometimes, well, how shall I put it, that we just don't know what the future will bring. Nobody knows that, and how things will continue. And in the invitation, you mentioned the word explosive, and Maximilian, you mentioned the word orally then during the webinar, and Raphael mentioned the powder keg on which we are certainly sitting. And the question is whether we can just suggest to people or insinuate that we will manage things, that this can work, especially if things get worse. Because otherwise we make the right even stronger. But you, Angeliki and Amina, and the others who participated in your study, you continue your work, you continue, you stay in contact with policymakers, and we're going to send you a link to the studies. The official launch of the study has not begun yet. What you've seen here was just some sort of sneak preview, but you all are planning a launching event with different actors from the regions, probably in mid-May. I think this is something I can already disclose here. And in Brussels, there will also be talks with politicians. And now this means that we're talking about the question, how can you reach politicians, the policymakers? And as Angeliki already said, the integration at the municipal level is also important. There too, you should talk to people because those people have to solve the practical problems. They are often thankful for an exchange. Now it's 8 o'clock, 8 p.m. So I can just say thank you very, very much on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation and Europe Calling. Max, as always, thanks for the wonderful cooperation. Thanks to all the speakers and all those who participated in the discussion. Our next webinar will come soon, I believe. We're planning, and your next event will come soon. We're also planning further events, and there are our newsletters with which we announce these events. Stay tuned. We stay in touch with the topic. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.